for everyone to be able to see. So do folks see that screen shared?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try to organize my own screen so I can, here we go, see things. All right, great. So this is a brief history, organizing for rent control in DC. And I am really excited about the Reclaim Rent Control campaign and all the work DC Jobs with Justice is doing on this. So we're gonna, I think I'm gonna talk for about 40 minutes or so. And like Farah said, I would love to, if I can take questions as we go, that'd be awesome. That might be logistically hard. We'll see. Hopefully that'll work out. I prefer to kind of have a conversational thing if we can. But at the end we'll have more time for specific questions and discussion and that kind of thing. So a brief history, rent control in DC. All right, how do I move this? Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to advance the slide in a way that actually works. All right. So we have these kind of phases of rent control. Starting in 1918, actually, there's it wasn't quite rent control, but it was something similar. So this first wartime emergency, World War I, we have the Great Depression, then we have a second wartime emergency during World War II. Then we have in the 1960s, the beginnings of rent strikes in the city and kind of more agitation for rent control. There's a very brief period of national rent control, so-called under Nixon. And then in the 70s, we start to see really significant tenant organizing and tenant militancy really here in DC. And then at the end, I really stopped most of the organizing research in this presentation in the 70s. There was a fair amount that happened in the 80s too, and then it kind of was sort of waxed and waned, I'd say, throughout the next couple of decades. But let's start so we'll just go in chronological order, of course. So with this first beginning in the teens, but just kind of the big picture here, this is from a report written by Stephen Diner called Regulation of Housing in the District of Columbia. It's a really great report that was written in 1983, published by UDC where I work, but about the history of housing regulation in DC. And so a lot of what I'm talking about comes from, what I found comes from his report. But one of the things I want to highlight here is that rent control in the district, as he writes here, has always been controversial, with landlords and the real estate industry almost always in opposition, tenants and labor unions in favor. And so that's just important to keep in mind, and we'll see that throughout the decades, that it's always been controversial. Landlords have fought it constantly, taken it to court constantly, and tenants, and sometimes with the help of organized labor, have really fought for it. And so we'll see that kind of over and over. And I think it's important to keep that big picture in mind. So beginning here during World War I. So the US enters World War I in 1917, and there's just tens of thousands of people coming to DC for jobs, wartime jobs. And so there's this housing shortage in the city because of that, which causes rents to spike. And in May of 1918, which is just sort of fascinating, is that the Civil Service Commission, this federal commission, reported that half of its job offers were being turned down because the salary wasn't enough to pay Washington's high rents. And so Congress was like, okay, this is a wartime emergency. We need these workers to come to Washington. They're not going to come because the rents are so high. We have to control the rents. And so Congress was convinced that landlords were making exorbitant profits on the war emergency. And in 1918, Congress approved a resolution freezing all tenancies in the city until a peace treaty was signed. So thinking until the war was over. And so during this freeze, landlords couldn't raise rents or evict tenants when their leases expired. And then that freeze was later extended to 90 days after the signing of a peace treaty. So this wasn't rent control exactly, but it was this freeze that was issued because of the war. This was immediately challenged in court by the real estate industry. And ultimately, the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia declared this resolution unconstitutional, arguing it was unreasonable because its necessary result was the taking of private property without compensation. And so that was this sort of early attempt to regulate rents in the city during the war. But what was also interesting at this time, and this I've been thinking about just very recently because of our current situation with the pandemic. 1918, of course, was also the year the Spanish flu really arrived, so-called Spanish flu. And so it arrived in DC. The first reported death in DC was September 2018 of the Spanish flu. And what's interesting is
Hello? Hi, Ms. Klein. My name is Adam Marshall from Neighborhood Legal Services Program. I'm a colleague of Ray Crichton's.
Excuse me, Adam. I think
my colleague Ray is our intake specialist.
All right, I muted him.
Okay, thanks.
Hopefully he'll figure out he's in the wrong place.
Right. So 1918, it's interesting to think about how these push for housing regulations and ultimately for rent control might have intersected with the crisis brought on by the influenza pandemic as much as the World War. And so one of the things you see here in this article from the Post in 1918, this one on the left, 72 dead from the flu, record for the district. Part of this article, one of the commissioners of the district was saying that landlords had to properly heat their apartment houses or rooms. Says he also made it plain that those landlords who fail to comply with the direction to furnish heat will be dealt with severely, and that the arbitrary seizure of apartment houses controlled by parsimonious landlords is not an impossibility. I thought that was very interesting. And the argument here, if you read the whole article, is that heat is necessary for people's health, to protect them during this time of the flu. So this connection is being made between public health and the right to safe housing here. If you look at the other article here, Tragedy of Tenants, and this is all about how, all these people were being evicted. The Washington Post is reporting on rent profiteering during the pandemic. So there were about 3,200 cases of rent extortion that were documented in the city during the war and the pandemic. And part of this article, what the reporter is writing is more stories of Washington rent profiteers whose avarice was not softened by the plight of widowed mothers grieving for sons slain in battle, and yet others whose demands knew no mercy when the influenza epidemic swept the capital city. Were laid bare before the Senate investigators yesterday. And so the Senate was investigating these charges of rent profiteering during the war and the pandemic. And so there's this piece here about this dead hero's mother being evicted wearing her gold star. Especially during the influenza epidemic, the courtroom was not large enough to hold the hordes of profiteers who came seeking to have tenants thrown into the street. They were literally there by the hundred. I don't believe I've seen such a sight in the 22 years of my legal practice. So the idea of landlords using something like a pandemic to essentially to evict tenants who can't pay, sort of taking advantage of that situation is 100 years old, nothing new. So it's interesting to think about how did this pandemic intersect with the organizing and attempts to get rent control, and I don't totally know the answer to that. And I should say that all this research is not finalized. I'm still working on this, so I'd love to have more questions about it as we go. But during the war, so the rent control was formally created in October of 1919. DC was the first city in the United States to get a rent control law. New York came the next year in 1920. So the law established a 3-person commission to fix and determine fair and reasonable rates and rentals of dwellings, apartments, hotels, and business properties in the District of Columbia. So interestingly, it covered commercial properties. The fair value of housing was determined by deducting the depreciation from replacement value and by considering critically the landlord's list of annual expenses. So it was a bit of a fuzzy formula. And the rent control guaranteed landlords a 6 to 10% profit off their property, which is interesting when you compare that to today, where I believe landlords are guaranteed up to a 12% return on their property via the rent control law. But someone else who's more familiar with rent control statute today can confirm that. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So the law was always temporary. Our rent control laws have always been temporary, set for a certain period of time. It was extended several times. Landlords constantly fought the law in court. And ultimately it was, the law expired in May 1925. But what's interesting about this first set of rent control laws, this rent control law that we first had starting in 1919, it appears it was passed largely because Congress was concerned that landlords were using the housing shortage to gouge tenants. And since so many of these tenants were new to the city, they were coming to work for the federal government, Congress really framed this as landlords gouging the US taxpayer, because the US taxpayer was paying the salaries of these US government workers. And the other problem was the federal government couldn't pay high enough wages to enable its workers to pay these market rents in the city. So adopting rent control was also a way to preempt demands for higher wages, which is interesting. And many members of Congress, and even President Coolidge, who was like famously pro-business, believed that if the city didn't have rent controls, the federal government would have to raise salaries. And this considerable new expense to the taxpayers would go almost entirely to what they called local rent profiteers. So this is sort of an interesting relationship there between the fight for rent control, but also recognizing that these very high rents were going to make workers demand higher salaries. So that was an interesting tension there. So, but ultimately they do, these controls expired in 1925. And now there is actually, a lot of this was initiated, like I said, by Congress, and not necessarily as much by working class people organizing for rent control. But there is, you know, some tenant organizing for sure as well going on here. And there was a group of tenants who were, there's actually a tenants league at the time, a citywide tenants league it was called. It was sponsored by the Socialist Party, which sponsored a mass meeting to discuss the housing situation and rental conditions. And at this meeting, and this article, this Washington Post article you see here refers to this, they decided to petition Coolidge to use the ellipse to set up army tents for people who were evicted for refusing to pay raised rents. And so the speakers at this meeting were predicting wholesale evictions, presumably, you know, after rent control was about to expire. And so they're predicting wholesale evictions after rent control expired. And they quote, urged the assembled tenants to determine to fight to a finish and to start by refusing to pay increasing rentals and also refusing to move when served with eviction notices. And so I don't know what actually happened with that. I don't know if they ended up pitching tents on the ellipse or not. Interestingly, at this time, there's also an effort to get a national rent control policy adopted. And many people involved in that effort for a national rent control policy saw DC as kind of the first step. So New York Congressman LaGuardia argued that conditions have come to a state where we must have permanent regulation of housing facilities in this country, and the best place to start is the District of Columbia. So I think this city has often, you know, because we are the nation's capital, we've often served as kind of a testing ground for ideas. And that was the thought here. So, like I said, rent control's never been permanently adopted, so it expired in 1925. And so then, you know, of course, just a few years later, the nation is plunged into the Great Depression. And then there's an effort to bring back rent control, bring it back in the city during the Depression. So in 1932, Congress launched an investigation into high rents in the city. And the commission that was overseeing this investigation warned restoration of rent to pre-Depression levels would force government workers, in the absence of a regulatory law, to adopt one of two unpleasant alternatives to the payment of such rents: to double up, as they recently did, or to engage in the bitterness and injustices of a general rent strike. I don't think there was a general rent strike at this time. It did not happen as far as I know. But so a bill was introduced in Congress by this guy, Henry Ellen Bogan of Pennsylvania, to reestablish rent control in the city, similar to how rent had been controlled in the 1920s. So this bill was out there.
There's one question, Amanda.
Yes.
I think you maybe said you didn't know this, but they said, were there wholesale evictions once rent control was lifted?
Yes, there were. There were. I don't have the data on that, but there were a lot of evictions. Yes, thank you. And I'd like to find out more about that, actually. So I don't know if I could say wholesale necessarily, but there were definitely evictions. Yeah. And so what was interesting during the time of the Great Depression also is that this is when labor started to get really involved in the fight for rent control in the city. And so this is labor unions were sponsoring mass meetings to agitate for rent control. And so this is a Washington Post article just about one of these meetings that was in 1936 sponsored by the Central Labor Union, in order to, quote, create sentiment for rent control. This meeting was attended by 800 people and was held at Central High School, which is pictured here. Now, this is interesting because Central High School was a white high school at the time during, segregated public education in the city. And it was really kind of the crown jewel of the white public school system. Central High is, in the 50s, sort of became Cardozo High School, a black high school, right before Brown versus Board, right before school integration. But at the time, it was a white high school, and I actually have a lot of questions about kind of interracial organizing at this time, and then I don't know the answers to them. But so this meeting was held at Central to demand reduced rents and improved living conditions. And at this meeting, the people at the meeting adopted a 3-point platform calling for a rent commission with broad powers, enactment of a law to ensure better housing conditions, and a federal authority to finance low-cost housing here. So a lot of the folks who fought for rent control were also fighting for federal financing of housing. And this is right before we had public housing. So they were calling for it, or for federal financing of the housing. So the meeting had been sponsored by the Washington Central Labor Union Rents and Housing Committee. And there were a lot of labor speakers, but one of the speakers I thought, interestingly, was E. Franklin Frazier, who's a sociology professor at Howard University. So I don't know what his involvement was exactly, but it does make me think about, what was the interracial nature of this organizing, and something I'd like to find out more about. Frazier was a sociologist, famous sociologist. He was the president of the American Sociology Association at one point, very well respected. And so he was speaking here at this labor rally on behalf of rent control in the 30s. So there's other examples of labor kind of supporting rent control. There's a couple other articles. The House will act on Ellenbogen rent measure. The district committee in the House to call up Bill tomorrow at the request of the union. Because of the insistence of organized labor in Washington, the House District Committee will call up the Ellenbogen rent control bill. The article over here on the right, women to fight sweatshops. So this is women who are part of these unions, also were looking at rent control. And then in the center, there's just a kind of nice letter to the editor in the Washington Post signed, a government worker, talking about sort of supporting the Central Labor Union for its resolution in support of rent control and trying to agitate for rent control. And this person ends, let us all get behind the Central Labor Union Committee on Rents and Low-Cost Housing to curtail the existing disgraceful exploitation of thousands of workers and raise the living standards for workers in the district. But this, they never got it. They never got rent control in the 30s. They never got rent control during the Great Depression. Support in Congress wasn't strong. One representative called rent control the quintessence of socialism. The bill was defeated. But I do think what's important from this period is the real involvement of labor in this struggle. So then we go to our next sort of era here is World War II. So in 1940, so there's sort of a buildup to US entrance into the war. And the federal government was hiring tons of people to work on the war effort. So in 1940, the Housing Committee of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, published a handbook of housing, which advocated rent control for DC specifically, warned that landlords would try to use the housing shortage in DC to exploit tenants. So again, we had a housing shortage because so many people were coming to the city to work on the war effort, and rents were really going up dramatically. And in July of 41, the Labor Department found our rents to be the highest in the United States. So a rent control bill was passed in December 1941, which froze rents as of back to January 1941, and it was to only last for the duration of the emergency, the wartime emergency. Now this version wasn't as strong as the version from the 1920s. The rent administrator, the person kind of overseeing rent control, couldn't initiate investigations on its own, so it relied on tenant complaints. And as people said at the time, tenants don't know enough about their rights to be able to make complaints about their rent levels if they think they're being charged too much. So it wasn't, it was certainly far from perfect, this version of rent control. Now, shortly after this DC version was passed, Congress created a national rent control program for designated defense rental areas under this agency called the Office of Price Administration. So there was some national rent control initiated at this time as well. So we had rent control. It was not particularly strong, but it was here. And then after Japan's surrender in 1945, local real estate groups began demanding an end to rent control in DC. They said, okay, the emergency's over. We don't need rent control anymore. Rufus Lusk, whose name sounds familiar to me, I think he or his progeny are still around in the real estate business in DC, but he was secretary of the Building Managers and Owners Association of the district and blamed rent control for the rise in evictions, the inflated price of houses, and the plight of the veterans seeking a place to live. And so I think that's similar to language you'll hear sometimes today when people say, actually, rent control makes it worse for people. Rent control is what the problem is. So this argument was being made, back in the 40s. And he described rent control as the last stand of the believers in a controlled economy. Nevertheless, the law was extended several times, and it finally expired in June 1953. So at this time, 53, the early 50s is also a period of rapid suburbanization in the United States, of course, including in DC, out of DC. White working class families could get cheap, federally insured mortgages in newly built, racially segregated suburbs. We also had public school integration in 1954. A lot of white families left after public school integration. So, so this sort of so-called white flight apparently eased the housing shortage in cities. I mean, that's an argument I've seen. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, but I would like to sort of look more into that. And I'm interested in how kind of white flight intersects with tenant activism. But regardless, we don't have any rent control, and there's not really much agitation for rent control at this time in the 50s. But in the 60s, we start to see another wave of tenant organizing. And actually, it's in the 60s that you really start to see the beginnings, I'd say, of a more militant tenant organizing going on. So the very first rent strike in DC took place in 1964. This was at 1414 Girard Street Northwest. And it was an 8-unit building, small building. Catherine Schuler was the tenant who really took leadership there. And she and the other tenants in the building were supported by students who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, many of whom were Howard students who were part of the Nonviolent Action Group at Howard, which was the SNCC-affiliated student group at Howard. And they supported those students. And now her son, Lorenzo, was a SNCC member, and so he connected her with SNCC. And those students did lots of things to support this rent strike. One of the things that they did was, one day when the marshals actually came to try to evict them, they held a sit-in and prevented that from happening. And they also connected the tenants to a Howard professor who defended them in court. So this was a big deal. This was the first rent strike in the city. And then moving forward from this one into the mid and late 60s, there was a whole lot more rent strikes popping up all over the city. Quite a number of them were supported either by SNCC or by Black student groups at other colleges. The Black Student Union at George Washington University supported a couple of rent strikes. And so there was this kind of flowering of rent strikes. And rent strikes were pretty much almost always started because of poor conditions in the housing. People saying, why are we paying rent for these shoddily maintained places? And in fact, by 1968, the city housing inspectors, like the people who worked for the city government, DC housing inspectors, were actively encouraging people to go on rent strike because the housing conditions were so terrible. I mean, it's rather remarkable, actually. Also at this time, which is super interesting, is there was a massive rent strike in public housing. And so these are just a couple of documents of that. The Black Land News, I am not familiar with this publication, but Maria McWhorter, who runs the really incredible DC 1968 project, the link is there in the slide. She included this in in her project, this article about his public housing strike. And then on the right there, you see a photograph. This is a photograph from the Washington Post, a meeting of the Citywide Tenants Union. And the Citywide Tenants Union was a union of public housing residents from around the city. And they started a rent strike in 1969 that was ongoing as of 1971. And there's lots of exciting stuff going on in terms of rent strikes in both privately owned houses and in public housing as well. So in the 1960s, there's this like problem of rising rents in many cities, and rents really outstripping the ability of people to pay. And so that combined with these poor housing conditions is what's prompting these strikes. And there's a lot of interest in bringing back some form of rent control. And so there's this article that was written in the Washingtonian magazine, which was a magazine that was started for a white audience really in the 1960s. And Sterling Tucker, who was the vice chair of the DC City Council, which still at this time was unelected. The city, that's a whole other story. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but the city, we lost all of our local voting rights in 1874, basically because the white business class didn't trust the Black vote. Black men were granted the right to vote in 1867, and shortly thereafter, in the 1870s, the white business class decided that they'd rather not have voting rights for anyone than let Black men exercise their political power. That's a whole other story. But point being that by 1969, we had an appointed city council, not elected. Sterling Tucker, was vice chair of this city council. And so he's writing an article for the Washingtonian magazine, so for a white audience, explaining that rents in the district have been increasing steadily at a rate of 5% a year. The lower quadrant, about 80,000 families in our city are probably paying well in excess of 25% of their gross income for rent. Tenants in these circumstances have a choice of shelter or food, shelter or clothing, shelter or stealing, shelter or violence. So he's making the case for rent control in this article.
Two questions, Amanda,
yeah.
when you have a chance.
Yeah.
The first one was asking if we know of any oral histories with activists who participated in these early rent strikes.
Natalie, such a ringer. Okay, so I did an oral history project last summer with activists who were not actually the ones from the 60s, though, not the earliest folks. I was talking more to folks in the 70s and 80s. And I don't know of oral histories with activists involved in these early rent strikes, but I would love for someone to do that project. It wasn't the DC Housing Authority that was encouraging public housing tenants to strike. No, sorry. It was people who worked for the DC the DC housing inspectors who worked for, I don't know if it was still DCRA back then or what the agency was called in the 60s, but they were working for the city as housing inspectors of privately owned housing. So they're going around and inspecting, just privately owned apartment buildings and seeing what terrible conditions people were living in. We're recommending that some folks might want to consider going on rent strike. Thank you, Sarah. All right, cool. Yeah, I'm like, it's hard to multitask here. Okay, so then we have, so briefly we have this Nixon's national rent control. I actually don't know a whole lot about this policy. And I've got this kind of jokey thing on this picture of Nixon on the right is actually from a Washington Post, a DC free weekly called the Daily Rag. It wasn't a daily, it was a weekly, but it was a sort of alternative newspaper, and they had this little ditty about Richard Nixon there in 1974. But so the White House, so here it's sort of highlighted, the president acting under the authority provided by the Economic Stabilization Act of 1970 established a ceiling on all prices, rents, wages, and salaries. And so this was an attempt to kind of deal with economic crisis. And it did not last long, but it did include national rent controls for this relatively brief period of time. And then those price controls were lifted in January 1973. Basically, right after he got reelected, those price controls were lifted. And so the elimination of these protections, meant that rents went up and really spurred tenant movements around the country. And at this time, municipalities started trying to, some municipalities started trying to establish their own local versions of rent control. So rents began to rise, as soon as these rent controls were lifted. In some cases, rent increases in DC approached 50%. There was this Washington Area Federation of Tenants Associations that existed in the early 70s. They held a meeting at All Souls Church, which some of you are familiar with, I'm sure. I've been to many DC Jobs with Justice events there. The Federation represented 150 tenants groups around the city, were considering calling for a mass rent strike. Ernest Withers, who's pictured here, was the president of that organization. I have no idea what happened. I have not found evidence of a mass rent strike, but there was discussion of that. And so there really is this kind of rise in tenant militancy starting in the early 1970s. In 1973, Congress agreed to give the city the power to impose local rent control. So our, again, appointed mayor, Walter Washington, asked for this authority and was granted it by Congress. So the rent control went into effect in August 1974, but was set to expire the following June, so a pretty short-lived act. But between August 74 and June 75, we had a major change in the city. We got a new home rule government. And pictured on the right, you see that very first city council that was elected in 1974, with Walter Washington seated at the center and the city council around him. And there were a number of very progressive civil rights activists, including folks who came out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, elected to this new city government. But at this time, the city is also experiencing a big wave of gentrification. And so you see this militant tenant movement emerging kind of out of the sort of reacting to this wave of gentrification, wave of evictions, working class people very concerned about displacement, and now having a locally elected government that was a whole lot more responsive to them than Congress had been when Congress had been overseeing the city, which it had been doing for the past 100 years. We've got a whole bunch of tenant organizing going on in the early 70s. Adams Morgan Organization was one really important group that was founded in 1972. And it was founded as essentially a community government for Adams Morgan, and which was a very diverse part of the city, Black, white, and Spanish, as you see here in the Washington Post. And the photo on the left is from a little bit later in the 70s, but they had many, many rallies demanding affordable housing and lots of stuff around affordable housing broadly. And they also did a lot of work around rent control specifically. And so this is an article highlighting the Adams Morgan Organization's work on rent control specifically. They're testifying at what was still then the unelected city council early in 1974. You see pictured here Angel Almedina, Marina Hickian, and Walter Pierce. They were three leaders of the Adams Morgan Organization testifying, concerned about what people called at that time the Georgetownization of neighborhoods, because Georgetown had been a neighborhood with a very significant Black population in the 1930s, and then had significantly lost that Black population over the years as it became a sort of cute and trendy and historic place for people with money to move to. So people were really concerned about Georgetownization. That was the word they used before they started thinking in terms of the term gentrification. Anyhow, you've got Adams Morgan folks really involved with this. Another group that was very involved around organizing for rent control in the 70s was the Citywide Housing Coalition, which was formed in 1974. They were really actually an attempt to bring together labor organizing and community organizing around the common concern of housing. And so Citywide Housing Coalition, James Garrett was an important leader, but there were many important leaders. Yolanda Ward, another very important leader. Michael Williams, and just to give you a sense of the Citywide Housing Coalition and what they were about, Michael Williams, he was recognized with a city council proclamation a couple years ago. And this proclamation, the city council said he worked to support tenants' rights as director of the Citywide Housing Coalition, and as a member of other organizations that helped enact rent control, the 1974 condo conversion moratorium, the first right of refusal law, and organized tenants to advocate for greater control of housing issues. He had originally been from Cincinnati, had been a co-founder of the Black Panther Party in Cincinnati, received a BA in political economy from Antioch College, received a JD from Antioch College of Law here in DC, and worked for the departments of Parks and Rec for over 20 years. So there was a lot of people with really kind of radical roots that were involved in a lot of this, in this organizing, and he's just one of many examples. So Citywide Housing Coalition did a lot of street activism. They also really worked within the system. They held this panel, for instance, to confront candidates on housing, city council candidates forum. And you'll note here, one of the many things they were asking them about was rent control. So this was, again, the first election, first home rule election that we had. The candidates were really being asked what they thought about housing and what they thought about rent control. Citywide also, this is their newsletter, the Citywide Struggle. They had, were constantly keeping people informed about what was going on with rent control, and also really trying to influence the specific policies and the shape that it would take. They wrote these position papers on rent control, and were really advocating for very specific policies around rent control. So they tried to sort of both be in the streets and also be advocating around really specific policies that they thought were more just. Okay, and so this newly elected city council, they took office in January 75, and they did create this new rent control law that went into effect in November of 75, which allowed landlords to raise rent by up to 5% a year, as long as they didn't show a profit of more than 8%. So today they're guaranteed at least 12%. This law in 75 said they couldn't profit more than 8%. This prohibited any rent increases for housing units that were not in compliance with the housing code, and increased the amount of notice landlords were required to give tenants in eviction cases. And then in 1976, I thought this was interesting, an amendment to the city's rent control law exempted new apartment buildings and newly renovated buildings and buildings with 4 or fewer units from the law. So as we know, the rent control law doesn't apply to buildings built before 1976. And I think this is why. I think it's because this amendment was put into place in 76. So this law was passed in 75. We got this rent control law. There was continued tenant organizing around all sorts of housing issues over the remainder of the decade and into the early 80s. This is just one of many, many examples of a protest that was documented by the Washington Post, but there are many that were not documented by the Post, organized by the Citywide Housing Coalition and the Gray Panthers. And then, anti-eviction protests, calls for eviction moratorium, 1978 was really a sort of banner year for tenant organizing in the city. And you highlighted here, you see Evelyn Anwachi, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. She at the time was chair of the Citywide Housing Coalition, said, we've been waiting for this eviction moratorium to happen for a long time. Our Stop People Removal campaign began last spring. We've been working for strong eviction and rent controls. Tenants who got notices because their buildings were to be discontinued, meaning taken off the rental market, now have extra time. And so bringing it up to the present, and I know we want to have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So the Rental Housing Act of 1985 is the basis of today's rent control law. And this law capped rent increases for units in all multifamily buildings with 5 or more units built before 1976. The law stipulated various ways rents could be raised, but there was no uniform standard for doing this. And then the Rent Control Reform Amendment Act of 2006 standardized these annual rent increases by capping them at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, plus 2%, and that's what we still have today. This law allows landlords to override rent restrictions through a hardship petition. It allows for vacancy decontrols. If the unit becomes vacant, a landlord can raise the rent by more, and allows for voluntary, so-called voluntary agreements to raise the rents beyond the restricted amount. And today, about 45% of DC's multifamily housing stock is covered by rent control, and that's compared to about 75% in the 90s. And so I would assume that comes about, that change is probably, much of it is because we've had a lot of new housing built, which isn't covered, no new housing is covered by rent control. And and other housing just kind of moving out of it for other reasons. So we've really had a significant loss in the amount of housing units that are subject to rent control today. And I think I'm excited to think about, we have 100 years of organizing for rent control in this city. And I think I'm excited about where this goes in the future. We have a really great opportunity this year to fight to renew it and, really importantly, to strengthen it. So I hope that you all, if you're not involved with the Reclaim Rent Control campaign, haven't signed on to that campaign, I hope you'll do that today. And let's have some discussion and take questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was amazing. So a couple people asked about this being recorded. Just to say, it is being recorded. We will post it to the Reclaim Rent Control website shortly. Someone asked, Scott asked if we know why they exempted newer buildings. So I will say, do you want to say anything about that, Amanda, or?
I don't know the exact reason. I would assume that, I think it has something to do with this idea they don't want to disincentivize the building of new housing, and this thought that rent control would do that, but I don't know, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I see Beth. I don't know if Beth, you want to add. I mean, my thought is too, I think this has been kind of a continuing compromise piece within various rent control fights, and that what we kind of hear is, as owners are getting their financing to have a new building, that having rent control laws can make it more difficult to get certain financing, can make it difficult for them to participate in certain subsidy programs. For example, low-income housing tax credit program is a 15-year program. And then, yeah, Beth said to encourage new development. This is something that, we've been talking to a lot of housing providers and developers on, and we have pretty broad support for the piece in the Reclaim Rent Control platform, which is that all buildings 15 years and older would be brought into rent control. I think that's adding 17,000 new units of housing immediately. And then every year, so this year would be 2005 and earlier, next year would be 2006 and earlier. Somebody asked if we know how likely it is for the council to renew rent control. So the council is definitely going to reauthorize rent control. That is not the fight that we're having, though. 100% of the council has said they will reauthorize. And what we're really saying to them is, if you think that DC doesn't have a housing crisis, then you should simply reauthorize, right? If you think that what's happening right now is good enough, then that's reauthorization. If you think we have a housing crisis and that we can do better in DC to keep rents affordable for people, to have predictable rent increases, to stop mass displacement, particularly of people of color and low-income people, then we need to expand and strengthen rent control. So that's really the Reclaim Rent Control platform has been developed with that in mind, right? With preserving affordable housing, predictable rent increases, getting rid of loopholes that displace people. And that is a fight, right? So that is something that we really need to build the movement of support on, and that's what this campaign is about. And we just really need folks to join the campaign, to be, talking to your council members, talking to council candidates about it. We think that reauthorization is a good hook to get improvements in the rent control law, because we really think, like, why would you just reauthorize a law that's not totally working? So that they need to do by December 2020. At the same time, this can be done at any point. So whatever we don't win at the time of reauthorization can be done with amendments. So that was, let's see how we're doing on questions. Okay, I think any development was slow in general between 75 and 2000. So that was on their minds as far as incentivizing development. Are there examples of rent control in DC where bad positions by council members were successfully turned into electoral positions, and lessons we could learn from that?
Do you mean like bad positions by council members were kind of turned against them and it enabled us to defeat them at the polls? Is that's the, yeah. Does someone else want to speak to that? Beth, I see you shaking, nodding your head. I don't know if there's specific.
I just unmuted you, Beth.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not talking to myself anymore. I'm actually talking to people. I've been sitting here talking to myself. I apologize that I can't remember the details of which part of the law it was, but there was a ballot initiative. I don't know if Cynthia Poles is on this, because Cynthia knows the details. But there was part of the law, and then there was a ballot initiative, and I apologize. My brain is such mush right now, but that definitely happened at least once. And it's something that I think some of us have talked about right now. Hopefully we don't get to that. Certainly all the changes we want would be multiple ballot initiatives, and that would be quite a process.
Somebody asked about, is it true that 45% of the city's buildings are under rent control? Yeah, we know that approximately 90,000 units of housing in DC are under rent control. There was a good report done by the Urban Institute not too long ago that has more specifics on this. And we're working with some researchers to update that. And we're hoping to come out with, by the fall, some fancy little maps that you can look at and see, where rent controlled units are, where subsidized housing is. It's a little bit, the city does not have a good database. So there's some complicated figuring out through using a number of different databases to figure it out, but we have a pretty good estimate. So even though it's really reduced, it's also a very significant part of DC's housing stock, and particularly DC's affordable housing stock, right? Did you want to add anything to that, Amanda?
No, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Somebody asked, what do we make of economists' perspective that rent control does not always meet the intended policy goal, and that it sometimes restricts housing supply, lowers the quality of housing? Yeah, I can say, I think this is something that probably depends jurisdictionally, right? I feel like there's a lot of good arguments that that is not the case in DC. Probably the biggest thing that restricts housing supply is the height limit, and that DC has a lot of density limits, right? So, and we know that landlords are making plenty of money in DC. That is definitely something that we know. And I will say from New York City, there's been some interesting research because they passed really stronger rent control laws, like 2 years ago. And that there was a little bit of a chilling of the market, and then it came back really strong. And so that kind of rebuked a lot of economists' arguments. Lowering the quality of housing, I will say honestly, like what I see is that there's not a huge correlation between how much money a landlord makes and the quality of housing, if that makes sense, right? I don't think, so I think there may be some cases of like small buildings where we need to look at supporting landlords to be able to keep them up to the code, particularly to do like big things like capital repairs, put a solar unit, on the roof. And so I think DC needs to look at those issues. But what we see from some of these provider petitions, from petitions that landlords put forth, is there's not necessarily a great correlation between how much money a landlord's making and how much they invest in their building. It's more about maybe how much money they want to make, or the quality of housing, or just the kind of landlord they're trying to be and the kind of housing that they're trying to run. But I do think, there's things that we need to think about, and we can definitely be nuanced on that. Negative impacts of rent control on renters, impacts on any particular types of renters. How are those negatives addressed? That might be a question for a different coalition. Not to sneak out of it, but we're really, we do see issues with the current rent control law, and we have plenty of information about that on the Reclaim Rent Control site, and on how some of these loopholes actually lead to displacement. I think our position is really strongly that renters deserve predictable housing costs, just like homeowners get, right? If you're a homeowner, you have a mortgage, maybe your taxes go up a little bit each year. But homeowners get that really predictable rent increase. What we really want to see is that renters could also similarly be able to plan for the future and have predictable housing costs. And that's really what rent control is. It's just, having a limit on how much the rent can be raised each year. We know that people a variety of incomes paying a variety of rents live in rent control housing in DC. One position of the Reclaim Rent Control platform is that every tenant in DC should only have one rent increase per year. So that's actually beyond rent controlled housing. It's just saying whatever housing you live in, you should only get one rent increase a year because that's fair, right? That makes it to where people can actually budget and have predictable increases. Let's see, Andrea. Current rent control guarantees a rate of return of investment on 12%. Yeah. So Andrea's right. It is 12% return on equity, not on profit. And that is something, yeah, thank you, Andrea. That's something that Reclaim Rent Control calls for a change for a lower percent in a profit rather than return on investment. Yes, and Beth Harrison from Legal Aid here did a really great webinar for us on that, on the hardship petitions. And we're going to be posting that to our website as well. So for people who want to kind of nerd out on that, you can. One thing that was a big takeaway for me was just that hardship petitions and this idea of the 12% rate of return is not working for small landlords, small providers who are probably the ones who really need it. It's working for actually the people who have more money in their building, who maybe have no mortgage, have more equity. So changing it to profit will really be something that will help both landlords who actually need it as well as tenants. Beth said it's about half of rentals, so maybe more than 45%. Okay, I think that's just somebody saying they learned a lot. That's great. Can we address TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, when it was started and if there were similar laws elsewhere?
I could do a little on that. So TOPA was first, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act was first passed in the late 70s, the original kind of version of it. And it gives tenants, yes, the opportunity to purchase if their landlord decides to put their building up for sale. It was actually originally first designed for single family homeowners. So if their landlord, put their house up for sale, they would have the sort of first right to buy it. And it was a couple of years later expanded to include multifamily buildings as well. And so that's been a very creative, it's a very creative piece of legislation, and it's a really, DC was very innovative in creating this when it did. So it was really, we usually date it to 1980 TOPA because that's when it was more, I guess, codified, it was more clarified kind of how it worked. But it was in the really late 70s that the law was actually first in the books. There are very few, and my understanding is there are very few similar laws elsewhere in the nation. I've actually been working with some folks recently to write an article that would be useful because there's lots of people trying, at least before this pandemic hit. I mean, things had gotten really kind of wonky, but over the past year, a lot of folks I've heard from in other parts of the country who are interested in creating TOPA for their cities or their jurisdictions, like Los Angeles, Minneapolis, the state of North Dakota. Like there's all sorts of people who are like interested in getting this legislation because they see it as a way to give tenants power when their landlords are going to sell those buildings. So I'd say there's a lot of interest nationwide and a lot of people looking to DC as an example of how TOPA works, what we've done to make it work well, how we've screwed up TOPA, so like hopefully other places can learn from us. But yeah, that's an exciting part of our tenants' rights history was the push to get TOPA and the fact that we actually got it.
Yeah, and there's really, as far as I know, not any very similar laws nationwide. The only other ones have to do more with like subsidized or housing that's owned by the jurisdiction. And they're in no way like as comprehensive. Also, the other unique thing about DC is that we have a trust fund to support low-income tenants in purchasing, and DC, last I knew, had the most significant trust fund of anywhere in the country. So a trust fund that really allows people to do that. Actually, the loopholes I was talking about, and again, I'll refer you to Reclaim Rent Control, to our website, and also we're having regular webinars on both Rent Control 101 and the Reclaim Rent Control platform. So if you sign on to the petition, and we can post that again in the chat, you'll get invited to those, and we'll talk more about our platform and how rent control works. But actually, I think what Catherine Green raises, there's currently an incentive for landlords to take voucher holders and take the apartments out of rent control. I agree that that's a loophole. Those apartments should go back into rent control. And so I actually don't know that that's something we've taken up, but I think it's a great idea. I was actually talking about like voluntary agreements and some of the provider petitions, which are another way that landlords get around rent control. Let's see. DC Council, emergency legislation that requires landlords to negotiate with renters and work payment plans, many feel does not go far enough. Do you think the cancel rent movement here in DC will be successful? Where can we find that rent control map of the city? Okay, rent control map of the city is forthcoming. So I'm not sure who we're asking about. Does the cancel rent movement in DC, will it be successful? You know, keep organizing, folks.
I think I would say that the payment plan thing is not going to work for many people. I mean, if you've lost your job and you haven't worked for 2 months, you're not going to be able to pay the back rent that you owe once you get a job again, whenever that is that you can get a job. I've been working with the DC Tenants Union in our effort to help support tenant organizing around the city right now. And I've been supporting efforts in one building in particular. Many of the tenants in that building, you know, most have lost their jobs. Many of them do not qualify for unemployment benefits. They don't get federal stimulus checks. They're not getting any benefits. They have had very low wage jobs in the first place. If they don't have a job, they can't pay rent. And it's not like they're saving money now to be able to pay rent in the future. They can't. And so many people in that building have told me time and time again, we can't do a payment plan. We can't, there's no money. There's no way to like work it out. You know, it's just the rent has to be canceled. And so those tenants are in the process of asking their landlord to cancel the rent for that building. But I don't know how successful that's going to be. They are now considering going on rent strike to really try to force the issue. I don't know how successful that will be. But I think the idea of getting the city to cancel rent, I think we have to ask that. We have got to demand it, because otherwise we are going to see mass evictions once the eviction, this temporary stay in evictions is lifted. People are going to owe months in back rent and they won't have jobs. Those jobs are not going to come back right away. So I think there is no choice really but to cancel rent. And I hope we're successful.
Thank you. And actually Beth corrected me about the vouchers, right? That those units do go back under rent control and at a lower rent if the rent was increased for voucher purposes. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think how vouchers work is maybe a different training, but but essentially the tenant pays 30% of their income towards rent, and voucher limits are up to 175% of fair market rent. But that's probably only going to make sense if you're a bit of a nerd anyway. So hashtag cancel rent. Thanks, Nicole. I put a link earlier to the DC Tenants Union. They have petition, I'll put it again. They have the cancel rent petition, and also really would love to encourage everybody who is a renter to join the DC Tenants Union, to join your chapter. There's still regular meetings happening via forums like this, and as well to join Reclaim Rent Control.
The restrictions on short-term rentals, I don't know as much as I should about that. Yeah, I mean, I know there's been organizing around that, and I know there's been a lot of discussion on the council about sort of problems with Airbnb, but I don't know if anyone has more specific information about that.
Yes, and right. Great. The council, Beth also updated us that today the council's emergency legislation also approved stopping eviction filings. We knew that there had been a huge number of evictions filed since the health crisis. So they were stopped through the emergency period in another 60 days. So that's also somewhat helpful. And definitely something that I would encourage folks to spread to your networks.
Is that, I was just gonna, just for my own clarification, is that 60 days past May 15th? Or,
hold on, I'm gonna unmute you, Beth.
Sorry.
Yeah, it is for the moment. I mean, I think everyone two things I will say about that. Everyone expects, of course, the mayor to extend, I think, beyond May 15th. But I think the other thing that is not 100% clear, if folks look even at what we know now about reopening plans, and I know DC's is not out, but if you look at other jurisdictions, I think what's going to happen during phases 1 and 2 in the 3-phase approach is that the public health emergency declaration probably remains in effect, but the restrictions are loosened. And so if that is the case, there still won't be eviction filings. Or foreclosure filings. The council also voted to stop foreclosure filings during the public health emergency for 60 days. And so we don't know that yet, but I think what most of us expect to happen, for example, is at some point the mayor lifts shelter in place, but the public health emergency declaration remains in effect. There are still restrictions on, for example, non-essential businesses. So we'll have to see how that plays out, but it could extend for a fairly long period depending on what happens. So hopefully that will be helpful. I also think, we're still waiting to hear from the court about exactly what they're going to do in the details. And certainly I and others have been part of those conversations. I think the court is going to start up fairly slowly, relatively speaking. And so of course, canceling rent would be a much broader, way to address the problem. And certainly tenants need some kind of financial help. And I agree with, what you said about that, Amanda. But I think everything will slow down. And so if we can get more financial supports of some kind in place, even if it isn't canceling rent, we're hoping that there will be time for tenants to try to work out those payment plans or something with the landlord before they face an actual eviction. So that's the good news. I realize it's incomplete news, but it's good news.
Thank you.
Cool. I think we might be at a good place to stop, but I don't know if you want to check over the last.
There was an earlier question, actually. Someone I think had asked about rent control for commercial properties. Businesses, someone had asked, it said businesses need help with the rent. And yeah, I mean, that is a huge issue. And I think, like I said, but that early rent control we had in the 20s did include commercial properties, which is interesting. I think the current campaign is definitely just focused on housing, but I agree with that, you think about the sort of displacement of small businesses in the city. That would be something to organize around, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do know, I don't think this is, since this webinar is really on, or this, this workshop has really been on the history of rent control and rent control organizing. So I don't think we can, I do know that the Tenants Union has been doing training specifically on the cancel rent platform. And I'm not like seeing anybody's picture pop up. I know that they also have been saying cancel mortgages. So that's my very short answer to that question about that. Awesome. Well, so again, I would really encourage people to sign on to the Reclaim Rent Control petition and platform. Check out, we'll be posting in the next couple of days the hardship petition webinar, this one. We actually don't have a recording yet of the intro one, but of what is rent control and the Reclaim Rent Control platform. But we'll be sending out announcements of when we're doing the next couple of those. So there'll be English and Spanish coming up, and we'll be recording those. Cool. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was really amazing. And
thank you. It was fun.
Inspiring.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.